Okay, Year 10, welcome back, and today we're going to be reading the first part of Stave 2. But before we start the reading, can you make sure you've gone and done your recap quiz for Stave 1 Part 2? So that was your first task this lesson. Go and see what you can remember from the reading that we did 2 lessons ago. Okay, if you need to do that, then please can you pause the video now? Okay, so before we begin the reading, make sure you've got a highlighter and a pen for annotating. Right, knitting needles at the ready, let's head on with Stave 2, the first of the 3 spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavouring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighbouring church struck the 4 quarters, so he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, and from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12! It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have got into the works. 12! He touched the spring of his repeater to correct this most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12, and stopped. "Why, it isn't possible," said Scrooge, "that I can have slept through a whole day, and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon." The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything, and could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after sight of this first of exchange pay to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge or his order and so forth would have become a mere United States security if there were no days to count by. Scrooge went to bed again and thought it over and over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavoured not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it is all a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released, to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Okay, so no key quotes in that first section, that first page. What you need to understand is, Scrooge went to bed at 2, and he wakes up because the clock has rung 12. So on the hour, an old-fashioned clock goes ding, 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 etc., and counts out the hours of what time it was. So because it's black outside, there's no light, he assumes it's 12 midnight, but then he remembers that he went to bed at 2, so he's really confused, and he's not sure whether he dreamt Marley's ghost at all. Okay, so let's pick up from here. Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3 quarters more, when he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. "Ding dong, 1/4 past," said Scrooge, counting. "Ding dong, 1/2 past," said Scrooge. "Ding dong, 1/4 to it," said Scrooge. "Ding dong, the hour itself," said Scrooge triumphantly, "and nothing else." He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge started up into a half recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them, as close to it as I now am to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. Okay, so just to clarify what that paragraph meant, Scrooge is asleep in one of those old-fashioned beds. It's a four-poster bed and it's got curtains around the side. This was because Victorian houses didn't have excellent plumbing and heating and were quite old and drafty. So if you wanted to stay warm at night, you couldn't turn on your little heated blanket or switch on your radiator. You had to get some curtains around your bed, so there would have been a drape over the top and curtains surrounding him. So he's laying on his side, okay, and the curtains that he is facing are drawn aside by a hand. When it says he starts up into a half recumbent attitude, he's still laying down, but he kind of props himself up on his elbows. Hope that makes sense. Right, so we're going to go on to our first main quote today. That is one that you're going to make a flashcard from. So it says, "It was a strange figure like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and been diminished to a child's proportions." So let's highlight this quote. So this simile compares the spirit to a child to give a sense of size and innocence. So this spirit really has this youthful appearance. It's quite small, and it's meant to represent Scrooge's childhood, or the state of being in childhood and the state of innocence. That's why it's small and looks like a child. So this adjective, I mean, it's an interesting one. So it's called strange. This could be because Scrooge finds it strange to look upon an innocent child. Scrooge is surrounded by miserable adults. Or it could be strange because it's got this juxtaposition of the innocent and the childlike, and then it's got huge amounts of wisdom. So that's probably why it's strange. Strange because there is a juxtaposition of innocence and goodness and wisdom. Okay. So if you need to copy those down, pause the video now. Okay. We're going to move on from its hair then. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. So we're just going to highlight white. It's not one of our key quotes, but it helps link us to this sense of innocence. Okay, so it held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and, in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. Okay, so it's got this juxtaposition of kind of the wintry. So we've got holly representing Christmas, but also these summer flowers. And people often say that, your childhood is the summer of your lifetime. I'm clearly far into the autumn. So maybe it could be a symbol of childhood. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using in its duller moments a great extinguisher for a cap which it now held under its arm. So I'm just going to highlight this. Not because it's one of the quotes you're going to use flashcards for, make a flashcard out of, but because I think it's worth annotating. Because light is a very important symbol. Light is used religiously to connote hope, goodness, truth, and happiness. Okay, if you've not got those down, can you just do that now? Okay, so let's carry on. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality. For as its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part and now in another, and what was light one instant at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. And in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close beside him, it were at a distance. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. "No, your past." Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, if anybody could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered. That's quite interesting, isn't it? That the spirit gives out the light, which connotes hope, goodness, truth, happiness, and Scrooge can't bear it. He wants it to go away. He wants that light to be covered. "What!" exclaimed the ghost, "would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?" So the spirit there is confirming that the light is symbolic, and that the cap that puts out the light is made by people like Scrooge. It's the opposite of those connotations of light, so hope, goodness, truth, and happiness. Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare," said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, "Your reclamation then take heed." So reclamation, to reclaim someone, it almost seems that it's a religious use there, as in, God is reclaiming him as one of his own, as one of his flock. It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and it clasped him gently by the arm. Rise and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that the bed was warm, and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication. So the spirit wants to take Scrooge out of the house to go and discover the world. Scrooge, of course, says, "I'm only wearing my nightie, my dressing gown, and my nightcap. It's below freezing outside, and what? You're trying to take me out of the window?" So what does he say when he realises the spirit wants to take him out the window? "I am mortal," remonstrated Scrooge, "and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, "and you should be upheld in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall, and stood upon an open country road, with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day, and snow upon the ground. Now, you might have noticed in Stave 1 that the description of Scrooge and his state is often linked to that pathetic fallacy about it being foggy and cold withal. And you will have noticed that it's freezing and it's night time, but when he passes into his childhood, whilst it's cold, it's a clear day. There's no fog, there's no snow. And Dickens uses the weather and uses pathetic fallacy to signify quite a lot about Scrooge's state. So here we see a lot about his childhood state, that it's a clear winter day. So he still has this clarity, he's not kind of weighed down with the fogginess and the murkiness of adult life yet. Good heavens, said Scrooge, Good heavens, said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. I was bred in this place. I was a boy here. The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odours floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. Your lip is trembling, said the ghost, and what is that upon your cheek? Okay, so I want you to highlight this quote. Okay, so this question, so this interrogative sentence, draws the reader's attention to a tear on Scrooge's cheek. So that means he's been emotionally affected by what he sees, what he feels, all that sensory imagery of the smells and the sights of his childhood are making him feel emotionally affected. And of course that tells us that there is a human in there, that he can be redeemed. He's not entirely heartless. Okay, so he can be brought back from his evil ways. Okay, so let's carry on. Scrooge muttered with an unusual catch in his voice that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. You recollect the way? Inquired the spirit. Remember it, cried Scrooge with fervour. I could walk it blindfold. Strange to have forgotten it for so many years, observed the ghost. Let us go on. Okay, so moving on. They walked along the road, Scrooge recognising every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were seen trotting towards them, with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other, until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. These are but the shadows of the things that have been, said the ghost. They have no consciousness of us. The jocund travellers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eye glisten, and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas as they parted at crossroads and byways for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas! What good had it ever done him? The school is not quite deserted, said the ghost. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still. Okay, so not one of our flashcard quotes, but one worth annotating for when you come back and revise. Okay, so this is a really emotive image, isn't it? Solitary child, so solitary on his own, neglected by his friends. So it creates sympathy for Scrooge. So up until now we've not really liked him, but it's really important that we do like him because we want him to be redeemed, we want him to get better. So creating sympathy at this point is a great tool for Dickens to use in order to get us on side with Scrooge's longer journey back to goodness. Right, so solitary child neglected by his friends is left there still. Carry on. Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick with a little weathercock-surmounted cupola on the roof and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used, their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken and their gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach-houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more attentive of its ancient state within, for entering the dreary hall, and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold, and vast. There was an earthy savour in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight, and not too much to eat. So, the description of Scrooge's school that he was at when he was a child, whilst his parents, or his dad as we find out, could afford to send him to school, which not all children were entitled to, and so not all children experienced. Actually, the school he was sent to wasn't very wealthy, wasn't very well off. It's not like his dad sent him off to Eton or anything. So his childhood being sent off to school was quite a bleak one in terms of the atmosphere he found himself in. So it smells like damp, doesn't it? And it's just a little bit ramshackle. Right, let's carry on. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. So, again, we've got very emotive imagery. Again, it prompts sympathy. And we've got this alliteration here, this feeble fire. So this soft alliteration reflecting the weakness of the fire, which creates, again, more sympathy for his discomfort. Okay, so let's pause while you copy that down. Okay, your turn. So, let's continue. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the panelling, not a drip from the half-thawed waterspout in the dull yard behind, not a sign among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, nor the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door. No, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with a softening influence and gave a freer passage to his tears. So Scrooge, upon seeing himself left alone at Christmas in school, all of his friends have gone home, and he's the only kid who's been made to stay at school for Christmas. It's grim. Scrooge is crying. Of course you would. So, excuse me. Let's move on. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window with an axe stuck in his belt and leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood. By ass they mean donkey, guys. Before we move on to the next paragraph, it's really important that you know that what we see next, this man that turns up, what we see next is Scrooge the child's imaginings. So we know he's reading by the fire. The spirit has brought to life all of these characters that he's reading about, so Scrooge can reminisce about himself being lost within these stories as a child. Okay? So let's read. Why, it's Ali Baba, Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Barber! Yes, yes, I know! One Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come for the first time, just like that. Poor boy! And Valentine," said Scrooge, "and his wild brother Orson, there they go, and what's his name, who was put down in his drawers asleep at the gate of Damascus. Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down by the genie. There he is upon his head. Serve him right. I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to a princess?" To hear Scrooge expending in all the earnestness of his nature on such subjects, in a most extraordinary voice between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city indeed. So Scrooge is getting really wrapped up in his reminiscence of the stories he's read as a child. Let's continue. "There's the parrot!" cried Scrooge. "Green body and yellow tail, with a thing like a lettuce growing out the top of his head. There he is. Poor Robin Crusoe, he called him, when he came home again after sailing round the island. Poor Robin Crusoe! Where have you been, Robin Crusoe? The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday, running for his life to the little creek. Hallo! Oop, hallo!" Then, with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said, in pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and cried again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff, "but it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge, "nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, that's all." So this is our next key quote for your flashcards. Okay, so essentially what this quote tells us is that Scrooge is feeling regret. So the boy, the carol singer who's mentioned in Stave 1, who came to his door and he told to go away, he's now saying, "I should like to have given him something." So really, anything, that noun, something, shows that he's realising that anything is better than nothing. So he doesn't say what, but just something, some kind of token, just something other than nothing. And I think this here, this short statement, it's quite simple, this short statement. Shows that Scrooge realises how simple kind acts can be. It doesn't have to be a lot, and the simplicity of that statement shows that he realises how simple those kind acts can be. So this verb here, so given, this verb obviously connotes generosity. Okay, so if you have not got that, so Scrooge just said that I should like to have given him something, that's all. So he's feeling that regret. The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked ladies were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that there he was alone again when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holiday. So it's clearly moved forward to a different Christmas in the same place, but the place has got a little bit worse for wear, so it's more run down. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and putting her arms about his neck, and often kissing him, addressed him as her dear, dear brother. Okay, so this is one of our key quotes for our flashcards today. So, that repetition of dear, so dear is an adjective. So it's not a use of dear as you would when you write a letter, dear Mrs. Dougal. It's not that kind of dear. It means that he is dear to her, so she loves him very much. So the repetition of dear shows that he's loved intensely. So we find out that Scrooge had a sister. Oh, well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because he's got a nephew called Fred. So we assumed he'd got a sibling, but where is his sister now? We might find out. I have come to bring you home, dear brother, said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. To bring you home, home, home. Home, little Fan, returned the boy. Yes, said the child, brimful of glee. Home for good and all, home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed, that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man, said the child, opening her eyes, and are never to come back here, but first we're to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world. So, not a flashcard quote, but one to highlight and annotate. This, of course, father is so much kinder, implies he was previously unkind. Okay, so not necessarily abusive, but he wasn't very kind to Scrooge. And he clearly likes Scrooge's little sister more because he's willing to do what she asks him to. Okay, let's continue. You are quite a woman, little Fen, exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him, in her childish eagerness, towards the door, and he, nothing loath to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, Bring down Master Scrooge's box there! And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shivering best parlour that was ever seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered instalments of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meagre servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he'd tasted before, he'd rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied to the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster good-bye right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoarfrost and snow from off the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. Always a delicate creature whom a breath might have withered, said the ghost, but she had a large heart. By she, we assume that the ghost is talking about Scrooge's sister. Interesting juxtaposition then, that she's got a large heart, yet he's so miserly. Okay, so we're just going to read up until here for today. Scrooge voice. So she had, cried Scrooge. You're right, I will not gainsay it, spirit. God forbid. She died a woman, said the ghost, and had, as I think, children. One child, Scrooge returned. True, said the ghost. Your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, yes. Right, so we've got this juxtaposition with stave 1. Okay, so we see his treatment of Fred. And his treatment of Fred, who's his nephew, is poor. And that obviously juxtaposes with the love of his sister. So we wonder, why does the child of his sister get treated so poorly if she was such a loving, warm person? So it makes Scrooge seem unfair and unreasonable, doesn't it? Okay, so that's all we are going to read for today. Can you please go back to the quotes that I have pointed out to you that are to become flashcards? Your first task is to write a 5 bullet point summary of everything we've read today. Your second task is to create flashcards. Now, I've got a couple of examples from last time. So, you begin with your quote and you look at where is it said, who says it, what do they say, when do they say it, and why do they say it. So why did Dickens put that in there? And then on the opposite side, you put your quote. You need to have at least one zoom on there. You need to say what that quote tells us. You need to have a technique on there. And then you need some context. How does this link to the Victorian era? So for each of the quotes that are both on the PowerPoint you've been sent and that I've picked out as being flashcard quotes. Okay, off you go, year 10. And next lesson we're going to analyse a little bit of what we've read.